20 years later, I clearly remember the day that I flew to Guantanamo Bay Naval Base in May 1995 for the first time. In fact, I remember it as clearly as the day I flew into Tegucigalpa, Honduras 12 years earlier to begin my Peace Corps service. Because both of these days were days of leaving everything familiar behind to go to a new place, do a job I've never done before. So both of these days were days of excitement and adventure and anticipation and uncertainty and some self-doubts and some concerns. My biggest concerns was, would I be happy doing this, and would I be effective? Maybe would I learn something? And there's a connection between my flight and work in Guantanamo and my Peace Corps service, because after Peace Corps, during those 12 years, I worked with different international programs. And I was working in Guatemala at the time, and on January 1st, 1995, I was in the midst of a training cycle. I was doing training for pre-service training for Peace Corps volunteers in small business development. And on January 1st, on that day, in a daytime party after New Year's, at the Peace Corps nurses' house in Antigua, Guatemala, I heard others talking about having applied for a job with the U.S. Department of Justice Community Relations Service to work with Cuban refugees at Guantanamo Bay Naval Base. And I was intrigued, and I wanted to hear a lot more about this. And this is what I found out, is that the previous year, starting in August, Castro, as he had done before in 1980, decided that he would not stop people from leaving Cuba. And when the word got out, Cubans, those that were anxious to leave the island and could never do that before, or couldn't do that since many, many years before, started building rafts. And they built rafts with inner tubes, and some of them were enormous. Some of them were actually as big as this room that they would build on top of apartment houses and lower down. I saw some of the photos of these. And they started going out into the ocean. And thousands started going out into the ocean. Now, the U.S. did not want the Cubans to reach the shores of the United States. Because maybe some of you have heard about the wet foot, dry foot policy that applies to Cubans and not other nationalities. If a Cuban arrives to the shore of the United States, it's very difficult to deport them. They usually won't be deported. But if they're intercepted at sea, they can be. So the Coast Guard started picking up all these people. And they kept coming, and all of a sudden there's 1,000 people on Coast Guard ships. And then the U.S. decided, well, what are we going to do? And they decided to bring these people to the U.S. naval base at Guantanamo Bay, which the U.S. had been in control of since 1903, because, and maybe specifically because, it's a place where you can house them, and it's a place where U.S. law selectively applies. So I decided I want this job, and I applied for the job in January of 1995. In April, I was told I got the job, and I was really excited, except that I was told I got a job to work in the office of this organization with the Department of Justice in Cuba, which is not what I wanted, but I figured I'm going, because I'll figure out, I want to get there and see how I can have an opportunity to work in the camps. So here is May 1995, I fly from Guatemala to Florida, I fly from Florida to Cuba to the naval base, and I'm taken in a shuttle bus to my new home, the Britannis cruise ship. Now, banish all notion you have of glamour when I say cruise ship. This was a joint military operation, a joint task force that involved all branches of the U.S. military and the Coast Guard. It involved the Immigration and Naturalization Service, it involved World Relief, which was doing social services, and involved the Department of Justice, Community Relations Services, which was my ticket in to get part of this. And they didn't have enough housing for everyone, so they brought in this cruise ship, so they had 1,000 people. They had base housing for many, but not for everyone, so 1,000 people were on the ship as a floating barracks. And my glamorous home was a very small room, shared with a very loudly snoring roommate. And I'm being the second one. I got the top bunk where I could touch the ceiling while I was lying down. I was not happy about that, but I was happy to be there. The next morning, I meet up with people I'm going to work with. We have breakfast. We go over to the office of CRS, Community Relations Service. I find that I'm going out to Camp Golf with Alberto, a Cuban-American who'd been there for a while. And I didn't know it at the time, but the deal was I was never going to work in the office. I was going to replace Alberto out in the camps. And there was a miscommunication, and I said, well, I found it out in a couple of days. So we got to the camps, a bunch of us go in a van, we dropped off at there's about 10 different camps. We get out to Camp Golf, there's about 2,000 Cubans there, we check into the military checkpoint, we go into the camp and then we're free to walk around. And this is what I see, is a desert surface with platform tents, so it's wooden platforms with a canvas side and canvas top, each housing about 10 to 15 men. There's about 150 to 200 of these tents lined up, one after the other. And it's just one out of maybe 10 camps. And Alberto starts introducing me to to some of the key people in the camp. And one of the things that I felt really confident about going on this new adventure of mine was, well, at least this time I know Spanish. Boy, Cuban Spanish, with medical slang, with Cuban slang, with immigration slang, with military slang, because I was down to like from 95% comprehension to maybe 60, and it was very challenging. And so we're meeting key people in the camp, and we're meeting the camp leaders. There was a guy named Julio, a guy named Raul. We were meeting the group of journalists that produced a daily newspaper. We met the artists who did these incredible paintings and sculptures. We met the weightlifters who had created weightlifting equipment out of scraps of concrete and steel. We met all these special people. But, in addition to them, there was everybody else that was bored, listless, some depressed, because the overriding feeling, aside from these people that found something to keep them entertained and busy, was they didn't want to be there. And, you know, with my opportunity to be in this place was I could leave at any second, that they couldn't. And that was the constant feeling I had there. So I took over Alberto's job, which was conflict prevention and resolution. And the reason that job existed was because previously there had been violence with some very serious injuries, so they started up this program. So my job every day was to go into the camp and just talk to people and find out what's going on. It was sort of like doing intelligence, but like out in the open. Because I would tell people, I'd say, I just want to find out what's going on here. Is there anything they're upset about? And if there was, see a way to communicate with the military to get people talking together. And I talked with Cubans hours and hours and hours, and I heard all their stories about their complaints about how tough it was in Cuba, how tough it was in the camps, and how they wanted to get the hell out of there. I met a whole lot of nice people. Now, of course, they didn't have a lot to do, so talking to me was a treat. And previously, the only ones that got to leave and actually got to the United States were people that had medical situations that couldn't be attended to by the Naval Hospital, and then when they were selected to go, they could take family members with them. But the other people didn't know how they were going to get off, if they were even going to be able to go to the United States. And then just before I got there, in May 1995, Janet Reno, the Attorney General at the time, had announced that there was an agreement with the Castro government that all those in Guantanamo would be able to go to the United States, but anyone else would just have to be brought back to Cuba. So there was a plan, and people knew they were going, and soon after that there was a lottery that they pulled names of the different camps out of the hat. In my camp, everyone was listening on the radio, the military radio station. When they called Camp Golf as number 2, the camp erupted in joy, and there were conga lines, and people knew they were going to get going. I felt some of their joy, because I knew that this is not where they wanted to be. And I got to go on one of those flights. And because each of those flights, they needed 1 or 2 chaperones or staff or something, and I had a leave of absence, so I got to go on one of the planes. Think about what it's like to be on a 727 where nearly every seat is someone on a journey to freedom. And it was so heartwarming to see people of which I knew some, but I knew the spirit of the Cuban people that were there getting to go to the United States. And we landed in Homestead Air Force Base in southern Florida, and they clapped and they cheered, and I was so happy to see that. I had no role at that point. I had a week vacation, and the plane actually then flew about 20 miles to Miami, so I was the only passenger on the plane for the last 20 miles, up and then down. So when I mentioned Guantanamo Bay Naval Base, and maybe you saw it in the writing here, I imagine a number of you thought about prison camp, Al-Qaeda, people that are detained. And I think of the travesty that's going on with the use of the naval base now. And it appalls me, and I want to see it end. But I wanted to tell you that since 1903, since the U.S. has had control, which is very questionable and long story, Guantanamo has had many, many histories and many stories. And one story, 20 years ago, was that Guantanamo served for 39,000 Cubans as a gateway to freedom. And I was glad to be part of that.